Chapter 1. The Farmer's Son Who Didn't Want the Land. Before the world begins to associate the name Ford with the roar of engines and the smell of oil, before Detroit becomes a symbol of industrial America, we have to go back to a place that seems almost opposite to all of that. To a field, to the land, to silence broken only by the wind and the sound of a horse pulling a plow. Henry Ford was born in 1863 in the state of Michigan, at a time when America was ending the Civil War and trying to understand itself again. The country was divided, yet full of energy. On the East Coast, cities were growing, railroads were expanding, factories were beginning to change the rhythm of work. But on farms, life moved differently, slower, repetitive, measured by the seasons. His father, William Ford, was a farmer, a tough, practical man grounded in the reality of the land. The land meant stability. The land meant security. The land was something you could pass down to your son. That was the plan. A natural, obvious plan. The son would take over the farm. He would work like his father. He would live like his father. But Henry saw it differently from the beginning. Imagine a boy standing in a field who, instead of seeing crops, sees a mechanism. Instead of thinking about harvest, he thinks about how something works. While other children learn to handle a horse, he takes apart a watch just to see what's inside. This was not ordinary curiosity. It was a need to understand motion. In the Ford household, a watch was not a toy. It was a tool, something precise, something valuable. Henry could sit for hours analyzing its mechanism, springs, gears, tension. When something broke in the neighborhood, people brought him their watches to repair. He was still a child, but he already had a reputation as someone who understood machines. His father saw it as talent. But talent that should be an addition to life, not its direction. Farm work required strength and endurance. It required accepting repetition. The same tasks every day, the same land, the same horizon. For many people, there was stability in that. For Henry, there was stagnation. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake. He simply did not feel connected to the land. He felt connected to motion. In the second half of the 19th century, something in America was beginning to change. Railroads cut across the country with lines of steel. Cities were growing faster than anyone expected. Machines were entering factories, and factories were drawing people away from farms. A new culture was forming, industrial culture. On a farm, patience and physical strength mattered. In a factory, precision and time were starting to matter. It was a subtle but fundamental difference. Agriculture depended on nature. Industry tried to control it. Henry was instinctively drawn to that second world, not because he dreamed of great wealth. At that time, he wasn't thinking in those terms. He simply could not accept the idea that he would spend his entire life repeating the same movements without understanding a mechanism larger than the field he stood on. When he was a teenager, he first encountered a steam engine used on the farm. It was a moment that stayed with him. Steam, pressure, the movement of a piston, a machine replacing the effort of a horse, a machine operating according to principles that could be learned, taken apart, understood. It was a different kind of power, not organic, mechanical. From that moment on, the land felt even more limiting. The relationship with his father grew quiet, but tense. There were no dramatic scenes, no major arguments. There was something more difficult, disappointment. The father saw his son's future in the field. The son saw it in the city. Detroit was not yet an industrial legend. It was a growing center, workshops, small plants, early automotive experiments. But for a young boy from a farm, it was the center of a new world. At 16, Henry made a decision. He left the farm. It was not an act of rebellion. It was a movement toward something he could not yet name. He was not running away from his father. He was running from stillness. Many people are born into a structure and accept it. Henry Ford was born into agricultural America, but mentally he already belonged to the industrial age before that age had fully formed. This is the first sign of his later obsession. Not money, not power, motion. The machine offered something the land did not, the possibility of acceleration. On the farm, time moved as it always had. In the city, time was beginning to be measured by efficiency, by quantity, by output, by seconds. Young Ford did not yet know that his entire life would become an attempt to master time through process. But even then, he felt that the world should not move so slowly. And when he left the farm, he was not only leaving the land behind, he was leaving behind the old rhythm of America. That decision, seemingly ordinary, was the first moment Henry Ford chose the machine over nature. And it was not just a change of profession, it was a change of era. Chapter 2. Detroit, a city of opportunity. When Henry Ford arrived in Detroit at 16, the city was not yet the industrial legend it would later become in the eyes of the world. It did not yet have that steel aura, that mass identity built on production. But it was something even more important. It was a place where everything was beginning to accelerate. Imagine a young boy stepping out of open fields and into a world of workshops. Instead of the smell of soil, the smell of grease. Instead of silence, the sound of metal striking metal. Instead of a distant horizon, walls, machines, people working to a rhythm determined not by weather, but by the clock. Henry did not come to Detroit as a visionary. He came as an apprentice. He took a job as a machinist's apprentice. The work was hard, monotonous, often thankless, long hours, little pay. But he did not see hardship. He saw access. Every machine he could touch was a lesson. Every engine taken apart was a puzzle to solve. On the farm, motion was natural, but uncontrolled. In a workshop, motion was the result of design. That difference fascinated him. In the 1870s and 1880s, America was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. Railroads crossed the continent. The telegraph shortened the distance between cities. And above it all, a new force was beginning to rise. Electricity. Electrification was not just technological progress. It was a shift in how people perceived the world. Night was no longer a barrier. Time was no longer the same limitation. Light could be switched on and off. Energy was no longer only steam, water, or muscle. Henry watched this up close when, after several years as a mechanic, he found work at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. It was a company that supplied electric power. Working there meant direct contact with the most advanced technology of the era. Imagine a young man who had recently been repairing neighbors' watches on a farm now standing at the center of a city's power system. Turbines, generators, wires, voltage, all of this infrastructure was more than machinery. It was a promise. Ford worked as an engineer operating the steam engines that powered the generators. It was not a symbolic role, it was responsibility. If something stopped, the lights went out. If a machine failed, the system failed. And this is where something began that would later become the foundation of his thinking. The understanding that a single machine is part of a larger mechanism. On a farm, a breakdown meant trouble for one household. In a city, a breakdown meant trouble for thousands. This industrial environment was his school not only in technology, but in structure. It taught him interdependence. It taught him that production is not a single motion, but a chain of connected parts. At Edison Illuminating Company, he worked under a name that was already a symbol of modernity, Thomas Edison. Edison was more than an inventor. He was the embodiment of America's belief in progress, in the idea that technology could change everything. Ford was still nobody significant. He was one of many employees. But he had something that drew attention, an obsession with internal combustion engines. After work, he built his own experimental designs. A gasoline engine, at a time when electricity and steam dominated industry, seemed risky, uncertain. In 1896, during a meeting of engineers from the Edison Illuminating Company in New York, Ford had the opportunity to present his internal combustion engine project to Edison himself. Pause for a moment and imagine that scene. A young engineer with no empire, no brand, no position. Across from him, a man whose name the entire country knew. Edison listened. He did not dismiss him. He did not laugh. According to accounts, he struck the table with his fist and said that this was the right direction, that the gasoline engine had a future. Was it a dramatic revelation? Probably less theatrical than later stories suggested, but for Ford, it mattered. Not because Edison gave him permission, but because he saw that his instinct was not isolated. Edison's role as a mentor was not daily guidance. It was not a classic master-student relationship. It was the presence of an example. Edison showed that invention is only the beginning. What matters is implementation, production, scale. Ford observed not just technology. He observed organization, laboratories, funding, testing, iteration. It was an environment where an idea had to become a working product. At the same time, Detroit was beginning to shift its identity. The city attracted mechanics, engineers, people with vision. Workshops multiplied. Attempts to build mechanical vehicles became more frequent. No one yet knew which design would survive, but the tension of coming change could be felt. Henry was not alone, and that is important. He was not operating in isolation. He was part of an environment alive with ideas. That industrial atmosphere mattered more than individual talent. Here, ideas collided. Here, mistakes were immediately visible. Here, effectiveness mattered. Over time, Ford was promoted at Edison Illuminating Company to the position of chief engineer. A stable salary, respect, security. For many, that would have been success. But if we go back to the farm in Michigan, to the boy taking apart watches, we see that stability was never his goal. Working at Edison Illuminating Company gave him something valuable: access to knowledge, exposure to modern technology, an understanding of scale. But it also showed him the limits of being part of someone else's system. He wanted to build his own, and when, in the evenings after work, he sat in his workshop assembling the parts of his first vehicle, he was not doing it for fame. He was doing it because he believed a machine could be personal. That motion could be freed from railroad tracks and contained in something smaller, more accessible. For now, remember this: Detroit did not give him the dream. Detroit gave him the environment where the dream could stop being fantasy. And that difference changes everything. Chapter 3: Early Failures and Conflict with Investors. Before the name Ford becomes associated with mass production, before the Model T reaches the roads, before the assembly line begins to set the rhythm of the world, Henry Ford must confront something that cannot be taken apart with a wrench or fixed with a screwdriver. Capital. By the end of the 19th century, Detroit is filled with a sense of excitement. Horseless vehicles are no longer just experiments. They are a promise of a new market. Engineers are building prototypes. Newspapers are writing about automobiles. Investors are beginning to see potential. Ford already has his first working design behind him, his quadricycle. A simple, lightweight, imperfect machine, but one that moves. That is enough to attract the attention of men with money. In 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company is formed. Ford enters a structure meant to turn an experiment into a product. This is the moment when a dream collides with economic reality. Imagine a young designer spending hours refining a mechanism, adjusting details, testing solutions. Now imagine a group of investors sitting around a table. Their questions are different. Not how does it work, but when do we start selling? Not is the engine efficient, but how much will it cost? Here begins the first real conflict. The Detroit Automobile Company produces cars that are heavy, expensive, and technically unfinished. Ford does not want to release anything that fails to meet his standards. The investors do not want to wait. Every month of delay means frozen capital. In the industrial world, time is beginning to mean money. In a literal sense, the company quickly runs into trouble. Production is slow, costs are high, quality is uneven. The market is not yet ready for expensive experimental vehicles. Investors begin to lose patience. In 1901, the Detroit Automobile Company collapses. It is Ford's first serious failure as a businessman. But let's look deeper. Why did the company fail? Because the product was flawed? Partly. Because the market was immature? Yes. But above all, because the vision of the engineer and the expectations of capital were not aligned. Investors saw the automobile as a luxury product for wealthy clients. Something elite, expensive, prestigious. Ford saw something else. He could not yet fully define it, but he felt that a car should be simple and accessible. For now, however, he does not have control. After the collapse of the first company, another structure is formed. The names of shareholders change. New pressure appears. Ford designs again, tests again, improves again. But investors begin to interfere. They want influence over the project. They want to speed up production. They want to decide. And here begins something that will return throughout his life, a refusal to surrender control over the process. For many entrepreneurs, capital is a tool. For Ford, it begins to feel like a threat, not because he fails to understand money. He understands that without financing, he cannot build a factory. But he does not accept a situation in which outsiders dictate the pace and direction. In the next company, which will later become Cadillac under different leadership, Ford leaves after a conflict. He disagrees with the investors' vision. They want cars that are more expensive, more refined. He is beginning to think more clearly about the opposite, simplification. Why did the early companies fail? Because the industry was young. Because the technology was unstable. Because production costs were high. Because the market was uncertain. But also because in this new industry, no one yet knew which business model would survive. It was an experiment on the scale of an entire city. During this period, Ford loses financially, but he gains something else, an understanding of the structural conflict between vision and capital. In the world of finance, return on investment matters. In the world of an engineer, perfection of the solution matters. Those two logics rarely move at the same speed. Ford begins to conclude that if he wants to realize his vision, he must build a company where the process is under his control, where technological decisions are not dictated by short-term profit. That does not mean he rejects money. It means he wants capital to serve the process, not the other way around. From today's perspective, it is easy to call this strong character, but at the time, it looked different. In Detroit, people began to say that Ford was difficult to work with, stubborn, unwilling to compromise. Perhaps. But look at it from another angle. Every failure reinforced his belief that the problem was not the idea of the automobile itself. The problem was the method of production and the structure of power over the product. He does not yet have the answer. He does not yet have the assembly line. He does not yet have the Model T. What he has is the experience of losing control. And that experience will stay with him, because when he later builds his own company, one of his first instincts will be to concentrate decision-making in his own hands. Process, design, pace, everything must be aligned. We will return to that. For now, remember this moment. Ford loses financially, but he gains something more fundamental, the conviction that a vision without control over structure is only an idea dependent on someone else's patience, and he no longer intends to depend on anyone. Chapter 4. The Birth of Ford Motor Company. After 2 failures, most people return to stable work and stop experimenting with risky dreams. Henry Ford did not return to stability. He returned to the workshop. At the beginning of the 20th century, Detroit begins to resemble a laboratory of the future. In warehouses, sheds, and small industrial spaces, new vehicle prototypes are taking shape. No one yet knows whether the automobile will become a mass means of transportation or remain an expensive curiosity for wealthy technology enthusiasts. The industry is young, unstable, almost chaotic. It is in this environment that, in 1903, the Ford Motor Company is formed. This is not just the founding of a company. It is the moment when Ford begins building a structure on his own terms. New partners enter cautiously. They are not romantic visionaries. They are men who see market potential, but remember previous failures. The capital they bring is not enormous. The company begins with relatively modest funding. Ford is not the majority owner. At the start, his share is smaller than later stories might suggest. And that matters. He does not build an empire overnight. He steps into a structure that requires cooperation, negotiation, and caution. The automotive market before 1908 is full of uncertainty. Oldsmobile is already producing vehicles, focusing on relative simplicity and limited series production. Cadillac begins building a reputation for quality and precision. Across the country, dozens of smaller manufacturers appear. Some will survive a few years. Most will disappear without a trace. At this time, the automobile is expensive, often unreliable, treated as a luxury toy. Customers are mostly wealthy individuals willing to accept imperfections in exchange for prestige and novelty. Ford watches this closely. He does not want to compete in the luxury segment. He is not interested in building the most expensive vehicle. Ornament does not fascinate him. His instinct tells him something different, that real change will not come through exclusivity, but through accessibility. But before that can happen, the company has to survive. The first models of Ford Motor Company, the Model A, then others designated by letters of the alphabet, are not breakthroughs. They are attempts at stabilization, attempts to find balance between quality and cost, between vision and financial reality. Ford begins to understand something he did not fully grasp in his earlier ventures, that a young industry requires patience. You cannot rebuild the world overnight. First, you have to keep the company alive. The survival strategy is gradual improvement. Production is still far from later mass scale. Cars are built in limited numbers. Every sale matters. Every customer is proof that the project makes sense. Competition is real. Oldsmobile focuses on relatively simplified production and captures the market as one of the first companies to sell vehicles in larger numbers. Cadillac builds a brand around quality and precision, attracting wealthy buyers. Ford must find his own place between these strategies. Notice something subtle. During this period, he is not yet the man of mass production. He is a designer learning the market. Each model is an experiment. Each decision is an attempt to understand what the customer truly needs. But beneath the surface, something more important is happening. Ford becomes increasingly focused on the manufacturing process itself, not just the car. He is interested in how to shorten production time, how to reduce unnecessary components, how to standardize parts. He is thinking in terms of systems, even if the system is not yet fully built. The ownership structure of the company also evolves. As the business begins to generate profit, Ford increases his influence. Gradually, he buys out shares. Slowly, he shifts the balance of power toward operational control. He does not do it abruptly. He does it consistently. In the young automotive industry, survival does not depend solely on technology. It depends on financial stability, investor confidence, and the ability to respond to a changing market. Ford learns to move within this world without abandoning his instincts. And here, his advantage begins to take shape. He does not want to build the best car for a few. He begins to think about the best process for many. He does not yet say it openly. He does not make grand declarations. But his decisions move in that direction, simplifying design. Treating cost not as a limitation, but as a tool for expansion. Detroit is accelerating. More workshops become factories. More people leave farms and move to the city. The atmosphere is dense with ambition. Ford Motor Company survives its early years, not spectacularly, not without tension, but steadily. And that stability will soon allow him to do something his competitors do not yet see. Redefine not only the product, but the very idea of the market. For now, remember this. The birth of Ford Motor Company was not an explosion of genius. It was a process of learning, negotiating, and building a structure that at the right moment would be ready for something larger, something that would change not only the company, but the pace of the entire world. Chapter 5. Model T. Simplicity as Strategy. Before the Model T appeared on the roads, the automobile was still something uncertain, expensive, temperamental, often treated as a toy for those who could afford to experiment with modernity. Vehicles were assembled almost by hand, varied in detail, and changed design from year to year. Every manufacturer tried to prove that its model was more elegant, more complex, more impressive. Henry Ford looked at this and saw chaos. Imagine a market where every unit is slightly different. Every part requires adjustment. Every mechanic has to improvise. In such a world, Production cannot be accelerated. It cannot be standardized. It cannot be made predictable. Ford began to understand something fundamental. If the automobile was to become common, it had to stop being unique. The Model T, introduced in 1908, was not the most luxurious vehicle. It was not the most technologically refined. It was not the most elegant. It was something else. It was designed for repeatability. That difference changes everything. From the beginning, the design of the Model T was guided by one question. How can this car be produced quickly, cheaply, and in large numbers? Not how to make it more impressive, not how to add more details, how to simplify. In this case, simplicity was not a lack of ambition. It was a strategy. Ford and his team committed to standardizing parts. Components had to be interchangeable. A mechanic in one town had to be able to install the same part manufactured hundreds of miles away without manually fitting it. This was a revolution in thinking. Until then, production resembled craftsmanship. The Model T began to resemble a system. Materials mattered as well. Ford used vanadium steel, lighter and stronger than what was commonly used at the time. The car had to be durable. It had to handle rough roads, mud, and the improvised infrastructure of rural America. This was not a vehicle for city showrooms. It was a vehicle for people who had previously relied on horses. Consider that for a moment. Ford was not designing a car for the elite. He was designing a tool for transportation, a tool for work, a tool for moving between places that had once been too far apart. That is why the Model T was revolutionary, not because it was the most advanced, but because it was the most thoughtfully designed for scale. The psychology of simplicity mattered as much as the engineering. The car was not meant to intimidate. It was not meant to require specialized knowledge from its owner. It had to be understandable, intuitive, in a sense, democratic. At the time, many manufacturers focused on model variety, yearly changes, new versions, and modifications. Ford did the opposite. He focused on one model. He improved it, but he did not complicate it. Over time, a famous phrase appeared, "Any color as long as it's black," often quoted, sometimes mocked. But it is worth understanding the context. Black paint used in mass production dried faster. It accelerated the process. It reduced the time between assembly stages. In a world where every minute of production was beginning to matter, color stopped being an aesthetic issue. It became part of strategy. It was not a whim. It was calculation. Here we can see clearly how Ford thought. For him, a detail was not decoration. It was part of the process. If something slowed production, it had to be simplified. If something complicated logistics, it had to be eliminated. The Model T was not a perfect car. It had limitations. It was plain, at times crude, but it fulfilled its function, and it did so repeatedly. That repeatability made possible something that had never been seen on that scale. The price of the car began to fall. Year after year, it became more accessible. More people could afford it. And here, something becomes visible only in hindsight. Ford was not just selling a car. He was selling access to mobility. He was selling a reduction in distance between places. He was selling a change in the pace of life. But for that to happen, he first had to submit the design to the logic of mass production. The Model T became the foundation on which the assembly line would soon be built. But even in its design, the seed of that idea was already present. Every part had its place. Every component was meant to be identical to the last. Every movement in the factory was meant to become predictable. This was not an accident. It was the consequence of earlier experiences, failures, conflicts with investors, observation of competitors. Before the world saw the assembly line, Ford had to understand that simplicity was not a limitation. It was a tool of expansion. And when the first thousands of Model Ts began leaving the factory, it became clear that this was not just another car among many. It was a turning point, not because it was the most impressive, but because it was the most repeatable. And in the world of industry, repeatability means control over time. Chapter 6. The Assembly Line, a Revolution of Process. At a certain point, the product itself stops being the most important thing. The Model T is selling better and better. Demand is rising faster than anyone would have predicted just a few years earlier. But with it comes pressure. Every car sold means another must be built. Every day of delay is a lost opportunity. Pause for a moment and imagine the factory in Highland Park in 1913. A hall filled with people, parts, tools, cars assembled in one place by groups of workers. The process still resembles craftsmanship on a larger scale. The vehicle stands still while men move around it. This image begins to irritate Ford. He is no longer thinking about the car, he is thinking about time. How many minutes does it take to install an axle? How many seconds to attach a wheel? How many steps does a worker take between one station and another? Highland Park was not an ordinary factory. It was a laboratory of work organization. In 1913, something begins that will later be called a revolution of process. The full continuous assembly line does not appear overnight. It evolves. First, a moving belt is introduced in one department, then in another. Gradually, the car stops standing still. It begins to move. A small physical change, but a fundamental mental shift. Instead of workers walking around the product moves past the workers. The reduction in production time is almost unbelievable. The assembly of a Model T, which once took about 12 hours, is reduced to several hours, and then to around 90 minutes. Each stage is broken down into simple, repeatable tasks. Every motion is analyzed. This is not just a technical innovation, it is a new way of thinking about work. Ford does not operate in isolation. At the time, the concept of scientific management is developing. Frederick Winslow Taylor analyzes workers' movements, measures task time, searches for the one best way. Taylorism assumes that work can be optimized by precisely breaking it into elements. Ford is not a theorist. He does not write treatises, but he observes and adapts. At Highland Park, the engineering of workflow becomes an obsession. Parts are delivered exactly where they are needed. Storage is reduced. Space is organized to minimize unnecessary movement. Each worker performs one specialized task. On one side, it is a triumph of efficiency. On the other, the beginning of something more unsettling. Because if the process is broken down into minimal elements, the human being is reduced to a single motion as well. Imagine a worker tightening the same bolt for 8 hours a day. He does not build the entire car. He does not see the whole. He performs a fragment, precise, repeatable, replaceable. Mechanizing the process leads to mechanizing labor. Pause and consider how immense this change is compared to the farm in Michigan where we began. There, a person was responsible for the entire cycle, from planting to harvest. Here, he becomes part of a larger machine. Ford sees efficiency in this. He sees the possibility of lowering costs. He sees a chance to make the car accessible to millions. But the social consequences are deeper. Highland Park begins attracting crowds of workers. Production rises dramatically. The price of the Model T falls. The car stops being a luxury. It becomes a tool of everyday life. Scientific management and Taylorism provide analytical tools. Ford provides scale. The difference between theory and practice is clear here. Taylor measures the movements of the individual. Ford organizes the entire flow. This is not just optimization of a workstation. It is the design of a complete production system. And here something must be seen clearly. The assembly line was not invented from nothing. Similar methods existed in meatpacking plants and in other industries. But Ford applied them to an industry that would reshape the country's social structure. Reducing production time meant more than greater profit. It meant accelerating the world. More cars on the road meant greater mobility. Greater mobility meant a change in how people lived. They could live farther from where they worked. They could travel. They could trade more quickly. But return to the hall at Highland Park. The sound of the conveyor moving slowly forward, the next chassis stopping at a station, hands performing one motion, then the next vehicle, then another. The rhythm becomes almost hypnotic. Ford achieves what he has wanted for years: control over the process. Every minute is planned, every stage predictable. Production stops being chaos. It becomes a mechanism. But a mechanism has its price. Worker turnover rises. The monotony exhausts people. Not everyone can endure the pace and repetition. Ford will soon have to respond to this problem in a way that will surprise the entire country. For now, remember this moment in 1913. Highland Park is not just a factory. It is a symbol of a new era, an era in which process becomes more important than the individual craftsman, an era in which efficiency becomes the measure of progress. The assembly line was not just a technical improvement, it was a declaration. The world can move faster if you organize it like a machine. Chapter 7. $5 a day. The assembly line accelerated everything: production, profits, the pace of work. But it also accelerated something Ford had not fully anticipated: human exhaustion. Highland Park operated like the mechanism of a precision clock, every movement planned, every task repeatable. Cars left the factory faster than ever before, the price of the Model T fell, demand increased, and at the same time, workers were leaving. Turnover was enormous. Thousands of men were hired, worked a few weeks, and then quit. The monotony, the speed, the lack of autonomy, not everyone could endure it. In 1913, to maintain a stable workforce of about 14,000 employees, the company had to hire tens of thousands of new workers over the course of a single year. Imagine the scale of that instability. Production is rising, but the foundation, the people, is unstable. The mechanism works, but the gears keep slipping out. Ford was not sentimental. He was not guided by a romantic vision of uplifting the working class. He looked at the problem as a system that needed stabilization. In January 1914, he announced a decision that would shock America. The minimum wage at Ford Motor Company would be $5 a day, nearly double the previous pay. The reaction was immediate. Newspapers described him as a visionary. Other industrialists called it madness. Economists wondered whether this experiment would ruin the company. Lines of applicants formed outside the factory. Detroit began to attract thousands of migrants from other states, from Europe, from the American South. Let's look deeper. Why did Ford do it? Higher wages reduced turnover. They stabilized the workforce. They lowered the costs of constantly training new employees. They helped maintain production speed without interruption. It was rational, systemic. But there was more to it. Ford began to understand that his workers could become his customers. If a worker earned enough to buy a Model T, a closed loop was created. The company paid wages. Workers bought the company's product. Money circulated within the system. This was not philanthropy, it was economic design. Consider the scale of this shift. Industry had long depended on minimizing labor costs. Low wages were the norm. Ford did the opposite. He raised wages while continuing to lower the price of his product. At first glance, it seemed contradictory, but it worked because of the efficiency of the assembly line. Reduced production costs allowed for profit even at lower retail prices. Higher sales volume compensated for lower margins per unit. The mechanism began to drive itself. The social consequences were enormous. Detroit grew at a pace the city had never seen before. Migration reshaped its social structure. New neighborhoods formed. Infrastructure strained under the pressure. The factory became a magnet, drawing people from across the country. But higher wages did not mean less control. Ford created a special unit, the sociological department, that monitored workers' lives. Investigators checked whether employees lived properly, saved money, avoided excessive drinking. Part of the wage depended on meeting certain standards. This was not pure generosity. It was a model in which the company entered private life to maintain system stability. Criticism was sharp. Some saw paternalism. Others accused Ford of trying to buy loyalty. Many industrialists argued that he was destabilizing the labor market by driving wages up elsewhere. And yet, admiration was real. For many workers, $5 a day meant the first real step toward the middle class. The ability to save. The ability to plan a future. Look at the broader picture. The assembly line made the worker part of the machine. $5 a day made him part of the market. It was a subtle but significant shift. Ford was not just building a factory. He was building a model of industrial society in which production and consumption fueled each other, in which the worker was not only a cost, but a potential customer. Of course, it was not perfect. The pace remained intense. The monotony did not disappear. The company's oversight of private life provoked resistance. But turnover fell. Stability increased. Production accelerated even further. The $5 day entered history as one of the boldest moves of early industrial capitalism, not because it was altruistic, but because it was systemic. Ford understood something many of his contemporaries ignored, that the durability of an empire depends not only on technology, but on the stability of the people who power it. At that moment, his vision extended beyond the factory. Because when thousands of workers left Highland Park with wages that allowed them to imagine owning their own car, a new chapter of American history began. Production was no longer separate from consumption. They became the same motion, and motion, as we know, was always what mattered most to Ford. Chapter 8. The River Rouge Empire. If Highland Park was a laboratory of process, River Rouge was meant to become something much larger, not just a factory, not just a cluster of production buildings. It was meant to be a closed industrial world, a system that feeds itself. When Ford looked at the rising sales of the Model T, he saw success, but he also saw dependency. Steel came from suppliers, coal from other companies, glass, rubber, transportation, every element was part of a chain he did not fully control. And for a man obsessed with mastering process, dependency was weakness. Pause for a moment and imagine the scale of this ambition. It was no longer about improving assembly. It was about controlling everything that led to the creation of a car. In the early 1920s, Ford began building the River Rouge complex in Dearborn, near Detroit. This was not an ordinary investment. It was a project of industrial self-sufficiency. Ships arrived at its own docks carrying iron ore. Coal went into its own coke ovens. Steel was produced on site. Glass was manufactured within the same complex. Wood, paint, components, everything in one place. The Rouge River became the artery of the system. This was not accidental. 20th century logistics was increasingly defined by the flow of raw materials and semi-finished goods. Ford understood that control over that flow meant advantage. Every intermediary meant delay. Every dependency meant risk. River Rouge was designed to minimize those risks. Earlier, we spoke of the assembly line as control over time within the factory. River Rouge was an attempt to control time across the entire production chain. A ship carrying ore arrives at the dock. The raw material moves to the blast furnace. Steel is produced. From steel come body panels. From panels, a car. All of it happens within one synchronized industrial organism. This was not just a factory, it was a city of production. Industrial self-sufficiency in Ford's version did not mean isolation from the world. It meant minimizing reliance on it. It meant building a system that supplied much of what it needed from within. Tens of thousands of people worked at River Rouge. Smoke from its stacks could be seen for miles. The complex became a symbol of American industrial power. At one point, it was the largest integrated industrial facility in the world. Scale was not a byproduct of ambition. It was a tool. The larger the scale, the lower the unit cost. The greater the output, the stronger the negotiating power in the market. Ford could dictate terms not because he was the only producer, but because he produced the most. Scale became a strategic advantage. Consider the difference. Earlier industry relied on networks of suppliers and subcontractors. Ford created a system that was nearly self-contained. Its own steel mills, its own rail lines, its own power plants. Every stage followed the same logic: simplify, accelerate, control. But River Rouge had its price. The more complex the system, the greater the responsibility. A failure in one area could paralyze the whole. Scale increased efficiency, but also risk. Managing such a complex required precision, discipline, and constant oversight. This was no longer a workshop in Detroit, not even Highland Park. It was industrial architecture resembling a living organism, massive, complex, synchronized. 20th century logistics took on new meaning. Transporting raw materials, managing inventory, planning production, everything had to be predictable. The boy who once took apart watches on a farm was now building a mechanism larger than anything he had ever seen. The difference was that this mechanism involved thousands of people and millions of tons of material. River Rouge became a symbol of America's faith in industry as the foundation of national power. Production was not just business, it was strength, proof that the country could manufacture on an unprecedented scale. But return to Ford himself. Why did he need such complete control? Because his past had taught him that dependency meant vulnerability, conflicts with investors, problems with suppliers, market instability, all reinforced his belief that only full integration provided security. River Rouge was the material expression of that philosophy. If the assembly line was a revolution within the factory, River Rouge was a revolution across the entire value chain. At this point, Ford ceased to be merely a car manufacturer. He became an architect of an industrial system in which raw material turned into finished product in one continuous movement, a movement larger than any single model, a movement that defined an era. And yet, like any mechanism built at such scale, it began to generate tensions that would one day prove more difficult to control than production itself. Chapter 9. War, Patriotism, and Military Production. Before the United States officially entered World War I in 1917, the conflict had already begun reshaping the rhythm of the world. Europe was engulfed in industrialized slaughter. This war did not resemble the battles of the past. It was a clash of factories, steel, railroads, chemistry, and logistics. The front line did not end at the trenches. It began in production halls. Henry Ford watched from a distance. At first, he publicly supported peace. In 1915, he even financed the well-known Peace Ship, a mission to Europe intended to promote an end to the war. The initiative ended in failure and criticism. Many considered it naive. Ford returned home with a sense of disappointment. But history does not stop at idealism. When the United States entered the war, industry became part of the military effort. The government needed trucks, engines, transport equipment. It needed scale. And at that time, scale meant one name. Pause for a moment and consider the shift. Only a few years earlier, Ford had fought to make his automobile accessible to ordinary people. Now the same production system was being drawn into the machinery of war. The relationship between industry and the state took on a new dimension during wartime. The government was no longer just a regulator. It became a partner, a client, and at times a source of pressure. Military contracts meant massive orders. They also meant adapting production to military needs. Ford Motor Company produced thousands of trucks, engines, and auxiliary equipment. Assembly lines designed for the civilian market were adjusted for the Army. The pace of work did not slow. If anything, it intensified. The war revealed something that had previously been only potential, that mass industry could become an instrument of the state. Wartime capitalism was not only about profit from contracts, it was about the tightening relationship between private enterprise and government structure. The state needed efficiency and scale. Industry needed orders and stability. In wartime, those interests aligned. But the cooperation was not without tension. For years, Ford had built independence. He controlled process, raw materials, logistics. Now he had to cooperate with administrators, with the military, with officials. He had to comply with contract requirements. It was another form of dependency. Consider the paradox. The man who pursued maximum autonomy in production became, during wartime, part of a larger structure, the structure of the state. War accelerated industrialization even further. It demonstrated that modern conflicts were won not only by soldiers, but by factories. The ability to produce equipment quickly became a strategic factor. Ford was not the only industrialist involved in the war effort, but his production system was among the most efficient. It confirmed something that had once been ambition, that organizing process could have not only economic significance, but geopolitical impact. After the war ended, the relationship between the state and industry did not return to its earlier simplicity. The experience of cooperation, contracts, and centralized production planning remained in the memory of both sides. The state saw that private enterprises could be strategic assets. Industry saw that the government could be its largest customer. It was a new chapter in capitalism. Pause and think about the implications. If production could shift from automobiles to military equipment, it meant the system was flexible. But it also meant the boundary between civilian and military markets had grown thinner. After the war, Ford returned to civilian production. But the experience left its mark. The scale of River Rouge, the logistics, the vertical integration all proved valuable not only in peacetime. The war did not alter his philosophy of control over process. It reinforced it. It showed that efficiency was not only competitive advantage, it was strategic potential. At this point, Ford ceased to be merely an industrialist. He became part of a larger narrative about how the 20th century would unfold, a century in which the state and industry would increasingly operate in tandem, not always enthusiastically, not always without conflict, but increasingly not separately. Chapter 10. Anti-Semitism and the Dearborn Independent. Up to this point, the story of Henry Ford could be told as one about process, scale, and control, about a man who subjected the world of production to the logic of motion. But the 20th century is not one-dimensional, and the people who shape it are even less so. In 1918, Ford purchased a local newspaper in Dearborn, the Dearborn Independent. At first, nothing about it seemed extraordinary. Many industrialists owned media outlets. A newspaper could serve as a communication tool, a platform of influence, a way to shape public opinion. But pause for a moment and consider what it means when a man who controls one of the largest industrial companies in the world also begins to control a media outlet. Between 1920 and 1922, the Independent published a series of anti-Semitic articles, later collected and released in book form as The International Jew. The texts repeated conspiracy theories and accusations about alleged Jewish control of finance and media, drawing on prejudices that already existed within segments of society. This was not a minor incident. The newspaper's circulation grew. The articles were widely distributed. Ford's name gave them weight they would not otherwise have carried. Pause again. Until now, we have spoken of a man seeking control over the production process. Here, we see an attempt to influence the process of thought. The reaction was not immediate, but it intensified. Jewish organizations protested. In Europe, the texts were translated and used by nationalist movements. Ford's image began to be associated not only with industry, but with ideological controversy. This was no longer a matter of private opinion. It was a matter of public influence. Ideology collided with business. Many commercial partners watched with concern. Ford Motor Company operated internationally. The brand was recognized worldwide. Every controversy echoed in markets where cars were being sold. Lawsuits became inevitable. In 1927, Ford was sued for libel by Aaron Shapiro, a Jewish lawyer. The case drew national attention. During the trial, the inner workings of the newspaper and Ford's role in it were examined publicly. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Ford issued a formal apology and shut down the Dearborn Independent. He stated that he had not been fully aware of the content published, though responsibility remained tied to his name. Was this episode an anomaly, or did it reflect deeper convictions? Historians continue to debate his level of involvement in editing and authorizing the articles. What is certain is that his stature gave the publications a scale and legitimacy they otherwise might not have achieved. Here arises the question of responsibility. Ford was not a politician. He was not a professional commentator. But he was a man whose decisions had consequences far beyond the factory floor. When he entered the media sphere, his influence was no longer limited to car prices or workplace organization. It became ideological influence. In the 20th century, media began to carry weight equal to that of factories. Narrative shaped public opinion. Public opinion influenced politics. Politics affected the economy. For years, Ford built a system in which control over process meant advantage. In the case of the Dearborn Independent, control over message led to the opposite outcome: damage to reputational stability. The criticism was sharp. In the United States and abroad, Ford's name was increasingly invoked in connection with prejudice, not only innovation. In Germany during the 1930s, his earlier publications were cited by Nazi circles, further burdening his legacy in later decades. Consider the contrast. The man who simplified the automobile complicated his own legacy. This chapter does not erase his earlier achievements, but it shows that the influence of an industrialist does not end with the product. When a name becomes a global brand, every word carries weight. Ideology and business rarely remain fully separate. When an entrepreneur steps into public debate, his company does not cease to exist. The market does not stop reacting. Partners do not stop calculating risk. Ford closed the newspaper. He withdrew from open media engagement. But the mark remained. And perhaps here lies one of the most important lessons of the story, that the scale which provides advantage in production also magnifies the consequences of error. An industrial empire can be managed with conveyor belts and schedules. The realm of ideology is less predictable. The 20th century remembers Ford not only as the creator of the assembly line, it also remembers him as a man who crossed the line between industry and ideology and paid for it with his reputation. Chapter 11. Union Conflict and the Brutality of Security. If the assembly line symbolized control over process, the 1930s would reveal how difficult it is to control people. The Great Depression reshaped the American landscape. Unemployment soared, social tensions intensified. In the automotive industry, a new force emerged: labor unions. The United Auto Workers, UAW, began organizing employees at General Motors and Chrysler. Sit-down strikes brought them victories. In 1935, the Wagner Act strengthened union rights and legalized collective bargaining. But there was one company that resisted this trend almost obsessively: Ford Motor Company. Pause for a moment and consider why Ford reacted so strongly. The man who raised wages to $5 a day, who built one of the most efficient production systems in the world, now faced demands to share authority within his factories. To him, unions were not simply worker organizations. They were an intrusion into the structure of control. At the center of this story stands Harry Bennett. He became head of Ford's service department, officially responsible for plant security. In practice, he built a system of surveillance and enforcement that resembled a private police force more than a conventional security division. Bennett developed a network of informants among employees. He monitored morale. He identified potential union organizers. his men did not hesitate to intimidate and at times to use violence. Imagine River Rouge not as a symbol of industrial power, but as a landscape of tension. Thousands of workers moving in the rhythm of the assembly line, overseen by a system designed to maintain discipline at any cost. In 1932, the so-called Ford Hunger March brought unemployed protesters to the gates of River Rouge. The demonstration ended in clashes with police and company security. Shots were fired. People were killed. The atmosphere around the company darkened. But the defining moment came a few years later. In 1937, UAW representatives attempted to distribute leaflets outside the River Rouge plant. The confrontation that followed became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Union organizers were beaten by Bennett's security men. Photographers captured the violence. The images were published in newspapers across the country. Brutality was no longer rumor. It was documented fact. Until then, Ford had symbolized efficiency and innovation. Now his name became associated with resistance to labor rights and industrial violence. Why was the resistance so intense? Because for Ford, a union meant losing direct control over the relationship between management and worker. The assembly line depended on precise organization. Every element had its place. A union introduced a new factor: negotiation. Negotiation means delay. Negotiation means shared authority. And Ford had built his empire on centralized decision-making. The limits of corporate power were being tested. Through new labor laws, the federal government strengthened unions. Public sympathy increasingly leaned toward workers suffering under depression conditions. Competitors recognized unions to avoid destabilizing production. Ford continued to resist, but the system he had built was too large to function in permanent conflict. Pressure mounted. Strikes elsewhere showed that ignoring organized labor could lead to greater losses. In 1941, after years of tension, Ford Motor Company finally recognized the UAW. It was a symbolic moment. The most resistant company in the automotive industry accepted collective bargaining. Consider what had happened. The man who had subjected production to strict logic had to acknowledge that control over people has limits. It is possible to optimize the flow of parts. It is far more difficult to optimize human aspiration. The union conflict reveals two sides of the same story. On one side, efficiency, scale, discipline. On the other, social tension, violence, the attempt to preserve control at any cost. Harry Bennett came to symbolize the darker side of the system. His methods were effective in the short term, but in the long term, they damaged the company's image and accelerated confrontation with public opinion. The boundaries of corporate power were set not by technology, but by society and law. At this point, Ford's story ceased to be only about innovation. It became a story about tension between efficiency and human autonomy. The 20th century was making one thing increasingly clear: industry does not exist in isolation. Chapter 12. The relationship with Edsel Ford. In every imperial story, there comes a moment when the question is no longer how to build it, but what happens next. For decades, Henry Ford had been the unquestioned center of decision-making, process, production, investment. Everything passed through him. Even when he did not formally hold the highest title, his word was final. But an empire that grows eventually demands continuity. In 1919, Ford bought out minority shareholders and gained nearly full control of the company. Shortly afterward, his son Edsel Ford became president of Ford Motor Company. Imagine a situation where the son stands at the head of the company, but the father still sits in the office next door. Officially, power has been transferred. In reality, the center of authority remains where it always was. Edsel was different from his father, more measured, interested in design, aesthetics, modernity. He understood that the market was changing, that customers were beginning to expect not only functionality, but style. He supported the development of new models, including Lincoln, and invested in more refined designs. Henry viewed this with reserve. To him, the automobile was a tool. It had to be simple, durable, affordable. Too many changes meant complication, and complication meant a loss of efficiency. The generational conflict did not erupt in dramatic scenes. It was more subtle. Edsel's decisions were sometimes reversed, projects delayed, initiatives limited by his father's skepticism. Pause and consider how difficult succession is in an empire built by a strong individual. The psychology of a founder has its own rules. When you have made every key decision for decades, it is difficult to let go of the wheel, even if you formally hand it over, even if you know the market demands change. Edsel represented modernity. He understood the competition from General Motors, which offered greater model variety, annual updates, and more flexibility toward consumer tastes. GM began gaining ground precisely because of what Ford had long avoided: variation. Henry remained loyal to the idea of standardization. The Model T stayed largely unchanged for years, even as the market began demanding something new. In their relationship, the tension between stability and adaptation became clear. Edsel tried to modernize the company. He supported more elegant vehicle designs and invested in the development of styling. He was more open to compromise. Henry saw this as a departure from the foundation that had created success. The cost of control became visible. When one person holds nearly all authority, the system becomes dependent on that person's convictions. Even if those convictions were correct in the past, they may not align with a new reality. Pause and look at this not only as a family conflict, but as a structural problem of succession. An empire built on a dominant personality struggles to transition into an institutional phase. Generational change requires not just a formal transfer of title, but a real transfer of influence. Edsel never gained full autonomy. Even as president, he remained in his father's shadow. Strategic decisions were often consulted, sometimes unilaterally corrected. The tension had consequences beyond the family. In the 1920s and 1930s, Ford Motor Company began losing market share to more adaptable competitors. A delayed response to changing consumer preferences cost the company its position as industry leader. The psychology of the founder proved as significant as technology. Henry Ford had built a system based on centralized control, but that same mechanism made adaptation more difficult as the world accelerated in new directions. The relationship with Edsel is, in a sense, the story of two visions, one rooted in the breakthrough of the early 20th century, the other attempting to respond to new conditions. Edsel, despite formally leading the company for many years, never fully escaped the dominating presence of his father. Their relationship remained complex, marked by respect, but also strain. When Edsel died in 1943 during World War II, Henry resumed direct control of the company. He was over 80 years old. His health was declining. The system he had built required new leadership. Consider the irony. The man who spent his life pursuing maximum control over process confronted a fact he could not control: time. Succession in an empire is not merely a formal matter. It is a test of the ability to relinquish power. And that can be more difficult than building a factory. Chapter 13. The Crisis of the Model T. There are moments in history when what was once the greatest strength begins to act as a limitation. For years, the Model T symbolized success. Prices fell, production increased, millions of units reached the roads. The car that was meant to be simple and accessible fulfilled its role. Ford Motor Company became a powerhouse. But the world does not stand still. Pause for a moment and imagine America in the mid-1920s. Roads are better. Customers are wealthier. The automobile is no longer only a tool of transportation. It becomes an expression of style, a choice, a reflection of aspiration. At the same time, General Motors develops a different strategy. Instead of one model, multiple brands: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Cadillac. Instead of one version, annual changes, new colors, new body lines, different price levels. This is not a technological revolution. It is a market revolution. For years, Ford believed stability was an advantage, that standardization allowed costs to fall and dominance to be maintained. The Model T remained largely unchanged for nearly 2 decades, improved technically, but visually and conceptually consistent. At first it worked, but over time, that same consistency began to look like stagnation. Pause and consider the psychology of success. If something brought you victory, the natural instinct is to hold on to it as long as possible. The Model T was proof that simplicity wins. Ford saw no reason to radically alter something that was still selling in enormous numbers. But the market does not ask about the past. It asks about the present. General Motors began to surpass Ford in sales. Customers chose variety. They chose comfort. They chose what looked modern. The Model T, once a symbol of the future, began to look like a relic. This is the moment when the trap of success becomes visible. Ford's system was designed for maximum efficiency around a single model. Assembly lines, vertical integration, logistics, everything was calibrated for the production of the Model T. Change would require resetting the entire machine. It would mean cost, risk, disruption of rhythm, system versus innovation. Innovation requires flexibility. A system built on perfect repeatability does not welcome flexibility. Ford resisted pressure for a long time. He believed the market would return to reason, that customers would value durability and price, that stylistic change was temporary. But the data became increasingly clear. In 1927, Ford made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. He halted production of the Model T. Factories were shut down for months to prepare for the introduction of a new model. Pause and consider the scale of that move. Stopping production in an empire built on continuity was like stopping a clock that had been ticking without interruption for years. The new Model A introduced more modern engineering, improved styling, greater comfort. Sales rose. The company regained part of the market. But the moment of unquestioned dominance had passed. What happened? It was not only about technology, it was about adaptation. Ford built a system perfect for a specific historical moment, when the automobile was a tool and the primary barrier was price. When that barrier began to fade, other factors gained importance: style, choice, identity. A system that minimized variation became less suited to a world that increasingly valued diversity. Every success creates a structure. Every structure over time becomes rigid. If it cannot adjust, it begins to limit what it once supported. Ford's stubbornness was not born of ignorance. It came from a deep conviction that the foundation that had delivered success remained correct. In a sense, he was right. Efficiency and simplicity still mattered, but the market had added new criteria. This chapter shows that the greatest challenge is not building a system. The greatest challenge is knowing when that system must change. The Model T was a symbol of breakthrough. Its crisis became a reminder that no dominance is permanent. And the pace of the world that Ford had helped accelerate began demanding something he liked least: flexibility. We will return to this when we look at his final years and how his legacy is judged over time. Because history does not reward only those who win. Sometimes the true reward is the ability to change. Chapter 14: Ford and the Great Depression. Only a few years earlier, Ford's factories had operated in a rhythm that seemed unstoppable. Assembly lines moved without pause, steel flowed into production halls, and cars left the plants in numbers that defined an era. The system appeared self-sustaining. The closed loop of production and consumption worked. Then the market collapsed. In 1929, the stock market bubble burst. In the years that followed, banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, unemployment rose at a pace few had imagined. The Great Depression was not only a financial crisis, it was a crisis of confidence in the entire economic structure. Pause for a moment and imagine River Rouge as orders begin to decline. Assembly lines designed to run at full capacity no longer have enough cars to build. A system built on scale begins to feel the weight of excess. Ford initially responds in a way that surprises some observers. He tries to maintain wages. At one point, he even raises pay, believing that higher purchasing power among workers might sustain demand. It echoes his earlier philosophy, that market stability begins with worker stability. But the scale of the crisis exceeds any single wage decision. Sales fall dramatically. Warehouses begin filling with unsold cars. Factories slow down and in some cases shut down entirely. Pause and recognize how severe the shift is. An empire that had grown almost continuously for years now reduces its own production. Workers lose jobs. Cities dependent on industry begin to feel the shock of unemployment. In 1932, thousands of unemployed men marched toward the River Rouge plant, demanding work and relief. The protest ends in clashes with police and security. Shots are fired. People are killed. The event becomes one of the most tragic episodes of the Depression in Detroit. Public reaction is intense. For many, Ford ceases to be a symbol of working-class advancement. He becomes a symbol of an industrial system unable to protect people during collapse. The Great Depression tests not just one company. It tests the very idea of industrial capitalism. Can a system built on private production and mass consumption survive a global collapse in demand? Does responsibility for workers rest solely with the entrepreneur or also with the state? In the 1930s, the role of government expands. New Deal programs introduce federal intervention into the economy. Labor regulations, unemployment relief, public works projects all alter the relationship between industry and the state. Ford does not always welcome these changes. He believes in the self-sufficiency of the system he built. But the crisis demonstrates that even the most integrated industrial complex cannot shield itself from global financial breakdown. Consider the paradox. The man who revolutionized production and lowered the price of the automobile must now confront whether his economic model contains built-in safeguards for recession. The wage policy he once used as a stabilizing tool is insufficient when the market contracts. Plant closures become reality. Unemployment rises, social tensions intensify, contributing to sharper union conflicts in the years that follow. Corporate social responsibility becomes a subject of public debate. Is an entrepreneur obligated to preserve employment at any cost? Does he have the right to protect profitability by reducing jobs? Where is the line between market logic and moral obligation to the community? Ford does not answer these questions directly. His actions are a mixture of pragmatism and conviction. He tries to keep the company alive. He cuts production. He adjusts costs. But he does not construct a social safety net on a national scale. That role shifts to the federal government. The Great Depression reveals that even the largest industrial empire is part of a larger economic structure. When banks collapse, when credit disappears, when demand shrinks, scale offers no absolute protection. And yet, Ford Motor Company survives, not without losses, not without tension, but it survives. The system designed for mass production proves capable of operating under harsher conditions. That reflects a certain resilience, even if its creator was not always inclined toward change. Pause and consider how the Great Depression reshapes perspective. Production ceases to be solely a source of pride and progress. It becomes a focal point for debate about responsibility, about the role of the entrepreneur in society, about the limits of the market. Ford enters the 1940s as a man who has experienced both the height of power and its limits. And though his factories will soon return to full capacity, this time in the rhythm of war, the shadow of the Great Depression remains, a reminder that no system is immune to shocks larger than itself. Chapter 15. The Philosophy of Work and Production. Throughout the previous chapters, we have observed Henry Ford's actions. Now we pause to examine what stood behind them. An assembly line does not appear by accident. River Rouge does not rise out of nothing. Every industrial structure begins with conviction. Ford held clear views on money, banks, work, and industry. They did not always align with economic orthodoxy, but they formed an internal logic that guided his decisions for decades. Let us begin with money. Ford repeatedly stated that money in itself was not the goal. In his speeches and writings, he emphasized that profit was the result of well-organized production, not its foundation. In My Life and Work, he argued that a company should serve society by delivering useful goods, and that profit follows efficiency. Notice the distinction. For many entrepreneurs, margin is the starting point. For Ford, the starting point was process. This did not mean he dismissed money. On the contrary, he understood its role in sustaining the system, but he saw it as a tool, not as the purpose of action. If the product was good and production efficient, He believed the market would respond. This conviction was a strength when he built the Model T. It became a limitation when the market demanded stylistic change and diversity. His attitude toward banks was more complex. Ford distrusted financiers. He saw speculation as a threat to the real economy. Capital, in his view, should serve production, not dominate it. He criticized credit systems when he believed they separated money from the tangible value created by labor. Consider how this reflected his early career experiences, when conflict with investors taught him that capital could attempt to dictate the pace of technology. Ford believed industry was the foundation of national strength. Production to him was more than economic activity. It was a moral obligation. In his thinking, a strong nation was one that manufactured. The factory symbolized progress, but also discipline. Work carried an almost ethical dimension. Ford believed work structured a person's life, that it provided order, meaning, and independence. He valued productivity as a virtue in itself. In this sense, his thinking was deeply rooted in the American tradition of self-discipline and practicality. His vision of labor, however, was also subordinate to system. The worker in the factory had a place within a larger mechanism. Ford did not idealize individual expression within the production process. He valued efficiency and order. A quotation often attributed to him states, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." Regardless of its exact wording, the meaning is clear. Belief precedes outcome. Here we reach something essential. Ford believed in a constructive mindset. If you assume something is possible, you begin searching for a method. If you assume it is impossible, the system halts at the level of belief. In his world, many limits were organizational rather than physical. This did not mean he ignored reality, but he believed many barriers were habits of thought. Industry, to him, was a domain of rationality. Chaos could be organized, process could be optimized, motion could be synchronized. This belief that the world could be designed according to logical principles was a foundation of his success. Consider what that implies. Ford was not mystical. He did not speak of spiritual awakening, but he believed that mindset shapes results. That discipline, consistency, and vision could transform reality. His ideology, however, had its shadows. His criticism of banks sometimes became oversimplified generalization. His faith in order could resist pluralism. His conviction in his own path sometimes made adaptation difficult. Ford's philosophy was not neutral. It was rooted in a specific historical context, in turn-of-the-century America, in a belief in technology as a tool of emancipation. Yet, from a distance, a coherent core appears. Produce something real. Simplify the process. Control quality. Treat money as a consequence of value, not its substitute. This was his mental map. It did not always lead him where history would later approve, but for a long time it allowed him to move ahead of his era. Pause and ask yourself, in your world, is money the objective or the result? Is the process you're building ordered? Do your convictions support your actions or limit them? Ford viewed industry as a system that could be designed. Perhaps the deeper lesson of his story is that one's own life can also be treated as a project with defined purpose, structure, and discipline. It is not about copying his solutions. It is about recognizing that every empire begins with a way of thinking, and that way of thinking is always the first assembly line we construct within ourselves. Chapter 16. Legacy. The system, not the man. In 1947, Henry Ford died at the age of 83. In his final years, his health had declined. His memory was sometimes unreliable. Decisions increasingly passed through others. The empire that had for decades been an extension of his will was beginning to function more as an institution than as a personal project. Imagine the silence after a man who had set the tempo of an entire industry for half a century. His voice was no longer in the office. His hand no longer intervened in design. What remained was the system. At the time of his death, the company's condition was complex. Ford Motor Company had survived the Great Depression. During World War II, it produced military equipment on an enormous scale, including the famous B-24 bombers at the Willow Run plant. The system, originally designed for civilian production, had demonstrated its flexibility under wartime pressure. But the company was no longer the unquestioned leader. Competition had matured. General Motors had become a giant managed in a more institutional way, less dependent on a single personality. Ford Motor Company had to modernize, to learn collective management, to build a structure less vulnerable to the fluctuations of one mind. And here we reach the core. Ford's legacy is not only a car brand, it is not even the assembly line as a technical solution. His legacy is a way of organizing work. Fordism. Fordism is more than conveyor belt production. It is an entire economic model based on mass production of standardized goods combined with mass wages for workers who then become consumers of those goods. It is the synchronization of production and consumption within one cycle. Mass production transformed not only the automotive industry, it became a model for factories around the world. Household appliances, clothing, food, electronics, the logic of the assembly line, standardization, and cost reduction became a foundation of the 20th century. But the structure of work changed as well. The craftsman who once controlled the entire production process was replaced by a worker specialized in one stage. Labor became more repetitive, more organized, more dependent on the rhythm of the machine. That had social consequences. Cities expanded around factories. The middle class grew through stable wages. Geographic mobility increased with the availability of the automobile. Time was no longer measured only by natural cycles. It was measured in work shifts, production hours, output. Ford was not the only architect of this era, but he was one of those who gave it a distinct rhythm. Consider the metaphor. On the farm where we began, rhythm was defined by the seasons. At Highland Park, rhythm was defined by the assembly line. At River Rouge, rhythm was defined by the flow of raw materials. Across the 20th century, rhythm was defined by mass production. Ford did not merely change how people moved, he changed how their time was organized. And here comes the final question. Is this legacy unambiguous? Mass production brought prosperity and accessibility. It also brought monotony of labor, standardization of lifestyle, pressure for efficiency. Fordism became a foundation of economic growth, but also a starting point for debates about alienation, automation, and the future of work. When we think of Henry Ford, it is easy to picture the man behind the wheel of a Model T. It is harder to see the structure he left behind. The man departs. The system remains. Factories, processes, management models, they evolve, but the core endures. The idea that the world can be organized into a sequence of repeatable actions leading to mass results became one of the defining principles of modernity. That is why this story does not end in 1947. It continues wherever you see an assembly line, in every logistics network, in every company that thinks in terms of scale, standardization, and lowering costs through simplification of process. Ford did not only transform transportation, he changed the rhythm of the world. And rhythm, as we have known since the beginning of this story, was what mattered most to him.